University. So, well, thank you so much for joining. I think it might be early morning for you, so thanks for joining at that time, but over to you.
Yeah, hey, good morning, everyone. Quick sound check, can you hear me okay? Okay, great. Yeah, so thank you for the invitation to Leah and Swenja. My name is Rafael Schmidt. I'm really excited to be here. Exciting topic, very timely and important. And I'm a senior scientist at the Natural Capital Project at Stanford University. My background is kind of like in between like environmental engineering and environmental modeling, and I've been working since several years on mapping and quantifying natural capital, not only, but with a very important focus on disaster risk reduction. And I'm going to give today some case studies for how we can go about mapping and quantifying natural capital and natural values, ecosystem services to design effective nature-based solutions and hopefully to mainstream the value of nature in different sectors, including the insurance sector. Next slide, please. And as the previous speaker already highlighted, nature provides many different values to society, different ecosystem services to society, from the provision of raw materials like food, fuel, and fiber, to provisioning clean water and air, to supporting agriculture via pollination. And very importantly, nature also provides some services that are immediately linked to risks, to natural hazards, and then eventually to risks. If you think about coastal protection, what was already mentioned, to hydrologic regulation for reducing both flood and drought severity, and, for example, slope stabilization to reduce geomorphic hazards such as mass movements and landslides. Next slide, please. However, one question that is, I guess, behind this workshop and that we face very commonly in our work at the Natural Capital Project is really the question, how can we quantify nature's role to minimize natural hazards? And this answering this question is then in sequence very important to understand where should we invest in nature-based solutions? Where can we invest limited funds to make sure that we get the greatest benefit for society, but also the greatest benefits for ecosystems and for nature. Next slide, please. But before I go into that, I want to quickly introduce the organization for which I work. So we're named the Natural Capital Project. We are an organization based at Stanford University. But we have core partners around the world. We collaborate with universities such as, for example, the Stockholm Resilience Center at Stockholm University and the University of Minnesota, the Chinese Academy of Sciences, but also some global NGOs and conservation organizations like the Nature Conservancy and WWF belong to our core partners. And as a result, we do not only do cutting-edge science, publishing papers on issues such as the impact of urban nature for providing ecosystem values or promoting the value of rivers as kind of key agents in ecosystem service provision. But we also work on new technology that we want to make available to users worldwide. We develop a software platform about which I'm going to talk in a minute. We promote the use of new satellite and remote sensing imagery for quantifying ecosystem services. And we have close partnerships with organizations ranging from global development, multilateral development banks, to on-the-ground grassroots organizations in the geographies in which we are working. And together, through these steps, we hope to have impact on real-world decision-making by making the value of nature more evident to decision-makers, to the general public, and then hopefully through that, hoping to mainstream that value into better decisions. Next slide, please. And one of the key products that we develop that I mentioned before is actually a software named INVEST, which stands for Integrated Valuation of Ecosystem Services and Trade-offs. The Invest software is a free open source software that is developed in-house by our software development team at Stanford University, and that has acquired a global user base and many thousand case studies around the world over the past years. Next slide, please. Today, the Invest tools offer users the ability to model many different ecosystem services, ranging from biophysical ecosystem services to services such as, for example, recreation or tourism and other services, such as, for example, pollination. We also, and this is probably what I want to highlight today, offer some services that model, offer some tools that model ecosystem services that directly link to natural hazards, such as, for example, water yield, flood routing, coastal protection, wave and wind energy mitigation, and slope stability. Those biophysical models are integrated into a wider suite of tools, for example, tools that enable users to optimize certain investments. For example, where should a certain amount of money be invested in nature-based solutions within a case study area in order to generate the greatest return on investment. And I'm not saying that not necessarily like in dollar values, but also like in terms of like biophysical values. So for example, where does an investment in nature-based solutions in a catchment would result in the greatest return on investment in terms of, for example, sustainable and reliable water yield from that catchment. Next slide, please. And just in a nutshell, for to give you an impression of how Invest works for everybody who's not in the like modeling sector, the challenge that we are facing is basically how do we represent the real landscape and all the ecosystem services that landscapes provide to people in a numerical way that can then be used for quantification of ecosystem services and decision analysis. And all Invest tools work in a relatively similar manner. We usually base the models on rasterized inputs, so basically representing different factors that are related to ecosystem services or to natural hazards, such as, for example, land cover, precipitation, soil, land management, and topography, as these pixelated maps, which is advantageous because it allows for a very flexible representation of these factors, flexible in the sense that we can mix and match in the sense of using coarse resolution or like very fine resolution data wherever we have them, and supplement them by coarse resolution data when it is required. Nearly all of our models include some sort of routing function to highlight the spatial dependencies between processes. So for example, how do like downstream beneficiaries benefit from upstream ecosystem services? And the model then provides spatially explicit representations of ecosystem services and beneficiaries across the modeling domain, and we have applied Invest on model domains on spatial extents ranging from very small local case studies to global assessments. Next slide, please. In general, Invest is not a standalone tool, but it needs to be integrated in a broader decision-making context. Just in a very high-level overview, in general, we do a lot of scoping with like local stakeholders. We compile data, as I mentioned before, trying to get as high resolution data as possible, and supplementing them with like coarser resolution data where required. We build scenarios together with our local partners, and we analyze and synthesize the results throughout different iterations, and eventually disseminate them through a wide range of communication channels, from peer-reviewed publications to workshops and different online platforms. Next slide, please. Now I would like to give you some like very brief overview over some hazard-related modeling that I've been leading in the past years, which is about innovating natural hazard assessment when it comes to landslides. And the background here is that landslides are a major hazard for life and infrastructure, particularly in mountain areas such as, for example, the Himalayas or the Andes. They are a major challenge also for rural development because they interrupt infrastructure such as roads and power lines. However, the challenge that we are facing is that current models that are applicable, particularly in large scales and in low data settings, are not able to capture the role of vegetation and nature, and they are also not able to capture where nature-based solutions can be most effective to reduce those hazards. And therefore, we also cannot really quantify the value of hazard reduction. In order to overcome that, I followed pretty much the kind of like invest strategy that I outlined before. Basically, we combined a gridded model of hill slope stability with graph theory to understand how landslides connect along the hill slopes, and a probabilistic rainfall model to understand the probability of slope failure, and therefore also the resulting value of avoiding those slope failures. Next slide, please.
Raphael, I'm just conscious of time, just as a reminder.
Thank you. And yeah, just to give you some results here, so I'm not going into details here, but like one of the key take homes is basically that we applied this model to this case study in Nepal to study how nature-based solutions benefit multiple sectors, from agriculture to transportation to even downstream hydropower. And that study that I invite you to have a look at highlighted that we can actually have a positive return on investment on these nature-based solutions if we target them in a strategic manner. Next slide, please. And yeah, just one example. Me and my colleagues have been working on many different aspects of valuing nature for reducing natural hazards, ranging from coastal hazards in the San Francisco area to global studies, working in the Himalayas and landslides, as I mentioned, to flooding in Myanmar, and land subsidence and climate risk in the Mekong data, just to highlight a few. And yeah, I'm looking forward to this discussion. And with that, I'd also like to end. Next slide. If you'd like to contact me, just be in touch here or visit our website for more information. Thank you.
Thank you, Raphael, and sorry to rush you a bit, but this was really interesting. Thank you so much. And I guess the key question would be to use the scenarios and the models that you have to then underpin a business case or use it for investment. I think this is what we then going to come back, and it would be great maybe later on the workshop to get your thoughts on that and how that actually works. So let's move swiftly to one input, which I think is actually really useful from ODI, Adriana Quevedo, who's been working actually with the UNFCCC on the global policy frameworks around using NBS and financing nature-based solutions. And well, I've asked Adriana to specifically look into this aspect of quantifying NBS and where that features and whether there is actually some guidance, because I guess we're looking at pretty much at a patchwork that exists, and that's also a challenge for investors, for insurers. But let's hear from Adriana. Thank you very much for joining.
Thanks, Swenja. Can you hear me all right? Yeah, brilliant. Next slide, please. Let's go right into it. I think before getting into the difficulties behind quantifying NBS, I think it's important to
We've just lost you, Adriana. Can you hear us? I think your connection might have just disappeared. Okay, Adriana? That's bad timing, just as she was starting. Okay, well, let's give her a moment. While we wait for Adriana to come back, I don't want to, because we're a little bit behind schedule anyway. Are there any questions from what you've heard so far? Any sort of question for clarification, also addressing Raphael, and I will try and pick up those for Wouter. Any quick questions while we wait for hopefully Adriana to reconnect?
Hi, sorry, I just got cut out.
You've just rejoined. Okay, well, if you are having a question, then write it down. We'll come back. I was just about to start the question and answer, but there you are. Okay, over to you now.
So sorry. Thank you so much. Just wanted to highlight here the importance of understanding the conceptual development of nature-based solutions over time. So this figure nicely shows how NBS has been adopted by international bodies over time, from the adoption in several resolutions by IUCN Congress to the reference in international commitments such as the Convention on Biological Diversity by the G7, the G20, the General Assembly, and in international dialogues. I think it's also interesting to note here that, as Swenja said, I've been working with UNFCCC Secretariat Standing Committee of Finance, and each year they do a forum and pick a theme. And because nature-based solution is such a big topic, the topic will be done for 2 years in a row, where the second one will be this year in Q3, where the actual date and location will be confirmed soon, so stay tuned. Next slide, please. So as we probably all know, the most widely used definition of NBS is taken from IUCN, as shown here on the slide. However, it's agreed that its interpretation at operational level has not been consistent, where there are many different terms used to represent NBS. So as you can see here, it can be from restoration, issue-specific, infrastructure, management, or protection. And each of these different terms are categorized as NBS. But as you can see, it's difficult to conceptualize all, and it's internationally agreed that the operational level of defining NBS has been quite confusing. So then IUCN actually in 2020 launched the 8 standards to support this gap, where essentially if you meet these 8 standards, then you can say that your project is an NBS. Next slide, please. So another key thing to note is the relationship between NBS and addressing climate change. I think as in previous presentations, you'll see different types of NBS addressing different climate hazards. So here's a table that's quite nicely categorizes this, which is from the Adaptation Gap Report UNEP 2020. So as you can see, depending on on the ecosystem and what climate hazards they face, whether it's coastal, intense precipitation, drought, rising temperatures, there are many different types of NBS that are being used to address them. And in turn, the last column, I wanted to reiterate that all of these NBS have also indirect benefits, which are very difficult to quantify. But here's an example of all the different additional benefits that one could consider depending on what NBS is chosen. Next slide, please. So I think this nicely links to the important characteristics that one should consider when thinking about NBS and building a business case. As many of us would know, making the economic case for NBS can be quite challenging, where I think it's just important to consider these characteristics. So one, nature-based solutions are always or can be categorized as a public good. So the benefits of such services does not exclude others from enjoying the benefits, and its value would not be diminished for others. So it just overall makes it difficult to quantify. And then the other characteristics, the time scale. Often NBS presents long time horizons over which the benefits of NBS materialize. Spatial scale, this is unique to each NBS. It's often done at large scale in order to be effective, but we have to consider the the ecosystem at hand, and it can cross different borders. And the fourth characteristics is that NBS is often dynamic. NBS needs to be dynamic to complement non-static ecosystems made of living components that change over time in its ecosystem. And then lastly, the performance reliability. The performance of NBS can be unreliable owing to the complex natural systems involved. So considering all of this as you're building a business case for NBS, there's other risks and additional costs that may occur as you're developing this business case. And these often include additional transaction costs, additional maintenance costs, and the overall opportunity cost of using the land that you're considering for NBS. And I think in general, these characteristics just make it challenging for us to think about quantifying NBS and the benefits. It doesn't mean it's a doom case, where it's exciting to see other speakers in this workshop explaining what they've done, but I think it's just important to consider these characteristics as you're building a business case for NBS. Next slide. And I'll leave it there for now. I think overall, I think this helps understand and potentially leverage and match different financing available for NBS, whether it's from public investment, carbon markets, impact investment, insurance, blended finance, water funds, debt swaps, etc. I think overall the importance of quantifying NBS really is important. Thanks. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Adriana, for that input. And I guess, we've sort of seen, there are different